Welcome back to my course, History of Socialism. Last time we talked about social democracy in European countries with the emphasis on Scandinavia, particularly Sweden. Okay. Today we're going back to the third world again. Remember, before we talked about social democracy, we discussed China. So now we are going back to explore how socialism spread in the third world. Particularly, our attention will be focused today on the African continent, where we have dozens of nations in the wake of the Second World War switching to socialism, different versions of socialism. Okay, and one of these countries will be used as an example, as a sample of socialism in Africa. Particularly, we're going to be focused on Tanzania, one of the countries in Eastern Africa. But the reason I brought social democracy before, in the beginning, to make a point. Remember, we mentioned that in the wake of the Second World War, in a few European countries, social democrats come to power or begin to share power with other parties. In England, for instance, and don't forget, England had the largest colonial empire. In England, we have the Labour Party coming to power, and from 1945 to 1951, Labourites or Social Democrats, using this continental European language, they had a chance to promote the projects, and one of these projects was to go away from the British Empire. Not only among social democrats in Western Europe, but in many other segments of society, among other political parties, there was a fatigue with colonial empires. Ruling elites in Europe realized that colonial empire was pretty burdensome. Instead of gaining, in fact, they were losing. Okay. Plus, on top of this, in the wake of the Second World War, when France, England, and other countries came to defeat the Nazi Germany, it was hard to justify the colonial rule over the other countries. Okay. So that is why, in response to the requests of local indigenous leaders in Asia and Africa, European masters, so to speak, they could not anymore to stay silent when they themselves liberated their own countries from the Nazi Germany rule. So how could they justify their own rule over the other countries? Okay, so there was no way to make an excuse for colonialism in the wake of the Second World War. Like, for instance, let's take France, for example. France was totally occupied by Nazi Germany. In the meantime, we know that France had the largest colonial empire in the third world after England. England was the #1 nation that had the largest colonial empire. So when France liberated herself from Nazi Germany, how could they say no to Asian and African colonies when they wanted to get freedom, to create their own nationhood? The same with England, or even though England was not occupied, but still England was fighting against Nazi Germany basically for preservation of her own nationhood. Okay, so how could they justify the colonial regime in UK after they defeated Nazi Germany? So the popular mood in Western European countries was against the colonial empires, and the same can be applicable to such countries as Netherlands. For instance, Netherlands had a few lucrative colonies. Okay. So that is why, in the wake of the Second World War, we have a large number of colonies receiving freedom. Some of them received freedom, independence from their former colonial masters in a peaceful manner. So there was no fight. There was no resistance on the part of France and England to colonies getting independence. Okay. There were a few countries, by the way, European countries, which did resist. And by the way, these countries were not occupied during the Second World War. See, it's the point I was trying to make, that the Second World War was a very important factor that swayed the public mood in Western European countries, which had been occupied by Nazi Germany, against colonialism. But in such countries like Portugal and Spain, which were not occupied by Nazi Germany, in fact, Spain was an ally of Nazi Germany, and Portugal, in fact, sympathized with Nazi Germany. So they didn't want to get rid of their colonial empires. In fact, Portugal resisted to the very end, well into the 1970s. Portugal, okay. But let's put aside these two countries, Spain and Portugal, marginal countries. Let's take these major countries, England, France, Netherlands, which occupied the most important place in the world economy. So in these countries, the public mood was against colonialism, okay. So we have dozens of countries in Asia and Africa receiving independence. Okay, very quickly in 1950s and 1960s, many of former colonial countries received independence. The first country, the biggest colonial country, was India. She was granted independence by Britain in 1947. Okay, but what happened after these countries? In particular, we're interested in Africa today. What happened in African countries after they received nationhood and independence will be something that we're interested here in. Okay, we are very much interested in what was going on after the independence was granted. And particularly, we're going to talk about different versions of socialism, which these newly independent countries chose on a mass scale, I would say. And I would like to emphasize this last point, on a mass scale. So many of these newly liberated countries in Africa, they chose socialism. Not necessarily the Soviet model, which was considered, as you know, before 1945, the blueprint, and in many respects after the Second World War. But many other models of socialism. Okay, but still it was socialism. Let's see why these newly liberated countries were swayed towards socialism. It's an interesting topic to research, to explore, because it tells us something about what was on the minds of the elites in these newly independent countries, how they were thinking about the political mainstream, what they tried to latch on, and how they viewed their former colonial masters. Okay. What I would like to bring to your attention is that socialism and communism in general had a great appeal in the third world in general and in Africa in particular. And this appeal lasted from 1950s to roughly the end of 1980s. Okay. But in the 1990s, socialism was going down worldwide and in Africa too. Okay. Let's go back to 1950s and let's see what was going on at that time in Africa. The former colonial masters England, France, Netherlands, were viewed by indigenous intellectuals, African intellectuals, as hegemonic force that they had to get rid of. Okay. And fighting against Western colonialism, they frequently were coming to a conclusion that they had to reject all Western culture, all Western political systems, all Western economic systems. So, to make a long story short, and I put it here on my slide, there were strong anti-Western sentiments in Africa and in other third world countries where former European where European countries had their former colonies. Okay, so West, which had colonies in the third world and in Africa, including Africa, was blamed for colonialism. Of course, we know that colonialism, it's not only Western invention. For example, right now, nowadays, China is actually behaves as the major colonial master in Africa, trying to penetrate African economies. There were Arabic countries in late medieval times, in early modern times, which also tried to penetrate eastern parts of Africa. But historically speaking, in modern times, it was, of course, the West that was able to grab the colonies all over the world, and that is why we talk about the Western colonialism. So in the eyes of these indigenous elites of Africa, West was to be blamed for not only colonialism, but for all kinds of evils. Okay, so it was a natural rejection. Along with colonialism, nationalist elites rejected all kind of Western traits or Western culture. I repeat, it was a natural response, like a backlash. Okay. Let me use this expression. Basically, what we see in African countries, which had been formerly dominated by Western powers, we have this desire to throw away with colonialism, with the water of colonialism, the baby of constitutionalism. So let me put this with, I think that's the best way to describe it. So they wanted this indigenous elites in Africa to throw away, along with the water of colonialism, to throw away the baby of constitutionalism. Okay, so constitutionalism, republic, rule of law, multi-party system, freedom of speech, these things were frequently rejected because these were considered as part of Western imposition. On the other hand, these indigenous elites of Africa were attracted to Soviet Union and China. So Soviet Union and China were held in the high esteem as role models. Why? Because these were two countries that challenged Western countries, especially China, so in many respects Soviet Union too. So basically you see two economically semi-backward country, in case of Soviet Russia, economically backward country, in case of China, which boldly challenged the West and said, we can cut ourselves from you, we can build our economies, we can build ourselves as national states. On top of this, we're going to have socialism. And it was very attractive. So basically, what we're talking here is their attraction of Soviet and Chinese models as a blueprint for these new countries of Africa to build up their own nationalism. See, nationalism in a socialist guise, okay, or in socialist garb. And since in these African countries there were hardly any traits of democracy, constitutionalism, so it was easy for them to be swayed to accept Soviet or Chinese blueprints, which were equally devoid of any constitutionalism or respect for human rights. So it was another reason why they newly independent African countries were easily sliding down this road. Okay, for many indigenous elites in Africa, Soviet and Chinese models served as a very good excuse to impose their own one-party rule or personal dictatorship. I don't want to say that these African nationalist leaders who came to power after colonialism was gone, they were necessarily bad, evil people. No, no. So many of them were driven by noble ideas. But the fact they used dictatorial Chinese and Soviet models had a wide appeal because it was closer to home. It resonated with their own experiences, okay? It not only did it resonate with their own experience of these leaders, it resonated with experience of part of the population in these countries, okay? For example, many of these newly liberated countries, they accepted a state-planned economies as a shortcut to modern world, okay? So they said, we're going to turn our new nations in powerful states, which also would be boldly challenge Western countries, which would become independent countries, okay, self-sufficient countries. And of course, it sounded very much appealing to the populace, indigenous populace, okay, because this nationalism mixed with socialism, it was a very, very attractive mix, attractive ideological mix. Look, my slide shows you that in the 1950s to 1980s, we had 58 states claiming socialism, different types of socialism. So basically nationalist dictatorships which claimed different brands of socialism. And 35 of these regimes claiming socialism were located in Africa, okay? Of course, the Soviets and the Chinese liked this idea that many African countries reached out to them, wanted to learn from them. It was a very, very, very appealing. In fact, at first in Soviet Russia and then in China, they created special institutes to train the leaders of the third world. For example, in the Soviet Union, within the Moscow State University, they created a special college. It was called Lumumba College of Friendship. Lumumba College of Friendship. Okay, Lumumba was one of the first leaders of Congo. Congo, it was a former Belgian colony right in the middle of tropical Africa. And he was friends with the Soviet Union. Okay. This college within the Moscow University gave free scholarships to the most prominent activists, left-leaning activists in the third world, who came to the Soviet Union to learn. Of course, they were indoctrinated in socialism. Okay, China did the same thing. They opened the doors to third world leaders, African leaders, and they came to China to learn about socialism. By the way, Western universities were not exactly a breeding ground for capitalism either, because we know that Western intellectuals who had a soft spot for socialism, they also in many respects served to plant socialist ideas in the minds of the third world people. For example, UK universities were very much a breeding ground for socialism, because socialism, as you know, we talked about it, remember, fellow travelers, in UK, in France, in Western Europe in general, in 1930s, 1940s, we have wide circles of intellectuals embracing different versions of socialism, loving the Soviet Union, remember? Many Western intellectuals were falling for the Soviet Union, for the Soviet experience. For example, in Great Britain, a famous institute, I'm sure you heard about it. It is called the London School of Economics. Okay, it's a famous institute created, by the way, two famous fellow travelers, Sidney and Beatrice Webb. I'm sure you heard these names. Remember Sidney and Beatrice Webb, who were known fellow travelers who traveled to the Soviet Union, who embraced the Stalin experience, and they even published a book, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, called the Soviet Civilization. The Soviet Civilization, where they glorified the Soviet experience. Okay, so in this London School of Economics, socialism was very much on the minds of many instructors, professors, and was preached to those third world leaders who came to study in the United States. Why do I emphasize this right now, this London School of Economics? Because one of the leaders of African socialism, whom we are going to discuss today, in fact, was studying in this realm. Not necessarily London School of Economics. He studied Julius Nyerere, the would-be president of Tanzania. Tanzania is the country we're going to discuss today. He was schooled in UK, in Edinburgh University, but I'm trying to describe to you the general setting in Europe that was very much favorable to socialism. So these third world leaders, not necessarily those who went to Soviet Union or China, but including those who went to Western European universities, they were also widely exposed to socialism. So socialism was on the minds of the people. Okay. Here, just before I came to deliver this lecture, I went online and I tried to find a map. Socialism in Africa. I couldn't find anything. There was no exact map except one map in Spanish. In Spanish, okay, was not an exact map. There was no map that showed African countries embracing different versions of socialism. So I quickly picked up this generic African map and generated this graphic visual to show you how many countries of Africa embrace different versions of socialism. So basically, what I'm going to show you on this map, again, look at this map. What do we see here? These countries where you can see like hammer and sickle. Okay, these countries embrace the Soviet experience. Soviet experience. So went to the Soviet Union, became clients of the Soviet Union. It's Angola, Mozambique, Somalia, Ethiopia, okay, Madagascar. There were some countries which declared Arabic socialism, okay. And also you can see them here. Mostly, of course, Northern Africa. And some of them too went to the Soviet Union asking for military help, but not all of them. Some of them were remaining neutral. Okay. There were also some countries, you can see here the flags. It's a brown, black, and green. It's the flag of with this sickle and spade in the middle. It's a flag of Pan-African Union. Pan-African Union. Okay, these symbols are used to label African socialism, countries which declared so-called African socialism. They said, we are not following the Soviet experience, but we are building African socialism built on our indigenous African values with some injections of Western socialism. Okay, and again, one of these countries we are going to discuss today, it's Tanzania. Okay, she was one of these countries which claimed that we are going to build our indigenous socialism. But some of these countries at some point they did go either to the Soviet Union or, like in case of Tanzania, to China. Okay, or in case of Zimbabwe, that also went to China, not even North Korea. Anyway, so three types of socialist regimes in Africa, 1960s, 1980s. Okay, so let's move on. And as I said, we're going to pick up one of these countries which claimed socialism and explore this country. The name of this country is Tanzania, located in Eastern Africa. Tanzania was a former German colony, in fact, German colony. But you know, Germany was defeated during the First World War. She lost her colonies, and this colony was seized by UK, by the British. Okay, and it was called Tanganyika. Tanganyika was actually an African name. I'm sorry, that's a name of the country when she was a colony. When she was a colony, and it was used by colonial masters. When country received independence, it was renamed into Tanzania. Tanzania, as far as I remember, it's indigenous designation of this particular area, not the whole area, but some coastal areas in Swahili. It's the most widespread language of Tanzania. Okay, so this colony, which was called Tanganyika, at first was a German colony that British inherited this colony because, remember, UK, France, United States defeated Germany and Ottoman Empire. Sometimes Tanganyika, for the sake of convenience, simply was referred as the British East Africa. Okay, there were several popular crops were growing here, corn, and one of the most widespread crops was peanuts. They were growing peanuts in this area. Okay, there were three types of people who lived in Tanzania by the time when the country received independence. And by the way, Tanzania received independence in 1961. So by the time she received independence, there were three groups of people. One tiny minority, the British people. So this white WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Okay, some of them moved back to England. Some of them remained professionals. Very tiny people, tiny group of people. But there was a large minority of Indians who moved there in the 1930s, 1940s, and the 1950s. Okay, English merchants, and the majority of population native Africans, mostly peasants. Okay, when Tanganyika, or British Eastern Africa, was still a colony, a group of indigenous African intellectuals started to spoke in favor of nationhood. In fact, I guess they didn't want to criticize the British colonial masters because there was a fear of repressions or something like this. So ironically, indigenous intellectuals who was speaking in favor of nationhood, they emerged as an organization of that was called TANU, T-A-N-U, called Tanganyikan African National Union, that was concerned with reducing the presence of Indian merchants in Tanzanian economy. So basically, the nationalist movement, indigenous movement, pro-independence movement among Tanzanian intellectuals emerged as a result of these complaints against the presence of Indian merchants in local economy. Okay, so there was a lot of grudge against English. Again, not so much against English, of course, they wanted independence, but against Indian merchants. The person whose name we have to remember, who became the leader of African socialism in Tanzania, was Julius Nyerere, who became, I would call him the benevolent socialist dictator of Tanzania. He was put in charge of this Tanganyikan national movement, TANU, the name of the political party. And by the way, when the English granted independence to Tanzania in 1961, TANU, his political party, was the only political force in the country that was able to organize people. Okay, so there was no other large organization. So it was natural that Julius Nyerere, who was the leader of this political party called Tanganyikan African National Union, TANU, abbreviation TANU, became the first president of the country. So Julius Nyerere became the first president because he was the leader of the major political organization in this country. There was no other one. Okay, Julius Nyerere was a son of a tribal chief, and he went through a Catholic schooling. He graduated from a Catholic missionary school, and he was a very, very talented guy who actually was recommended to work as a teacher by local English missionaries. And these missionaries gave him a scholarship to go to UK to be to do his studies, to continue his studies in Edinburgh University in Scotland, as you know. Okay, 1949. Interesting, when he came to UK, started to study in Edinburgh University, he was exposed to ideas of socialism, as I said, because the whole setting in UK at that time was a very, very much favorable to socialist ideas. But he was not interested in the Soviet experience because he believed the Soviets were too militant, too radical, inhumane. Okay, so what he became attracted to was the Fabians. So he mingled with Fabians. Okay, he read the works. He spoke with people who were Fabians, and he very much became attracted to their ideas. Remember who Fabians were? They believed in the power of a big welfare state to navigate people to the bright future. They didn't believe in the revolution. In fact, they accused the Russian Bolsheviks, Russian communists, in being violent people, so they didn't like them. Okay, some Fabians were okay, of course, they were soft on Bolsheviks, but many of them didn't like the Bolsheviks. Okay, so they were speaking against the revolution. They believed in the reforms and gradual reforms. Okay, And that's what Julius Nyerere embraced too. So from UK, he came back a convinced socialist. So he became a converted socialist. He liked socialism, but at the same time, he started thinking about his own African experiences, because when he was a child, a teenager, he was exposed, of course, to... He didn't live in a city. He basically lived in a village setting when he was a teenager back at home. So he was exposed to local African communal life, and he had a sort of nostalgia for some of this lifestyle. So he started to demonstrate a typical behavior of a third world intellectual, okay, or an intellectual who was coming from a like colonial periphery, like trying to romanticize his own local African experiences, trying to argue that African peasants in general and Tanzanian peasants in particular were inherent socialists. They had a communal life that helped each other. Interesting. So it's reminds me of the behavior of a Russian populist, remember, who embraced a Russian peasant commune, who glorified the Russian peasantry, who said that Russian peasants had been organic socialists, okay, they were collectivists, and they tried somehow to merge these ideas with ideas of socialism. I remember one of these girls, Russian girls populist, even wrote to Karl Marx. In one of our first lectures we talked about it. She tried to reconcile Marxism with this peasant socialism, and then Karl Marx felt very much uncomfortable about this, because Karl Marx argued that there was no such thing as peasant socialism. So each country, a backward country, economically backward country, should be ripe enough for socialism. It should go through a stage of capitalism, through a stage of modernization for a country to have proletariat, industrial proletariat, in order to kind of graduate, to mature, to be ready, to be ripe for the socialist experience, okay? So Julius Nyerere behaved exactly like these Russian populists. So he romanticized his own indigenous experiences, the peasant community in Africa. And basically what he did, he married ideas of Fabian ideas, Fabian socialism, with his traditional culture, or mythology he created. I wouldn't say traditional culture, with the image of this romantic image of his own indigenous country. And he offered this ideology for his people back at home, and a lot of people liked it, okay, because Fabianism, this Fabian socialism, on the one hand offered this idea of modern life, modernization, but at the same time Julius Nyerere and his supporters back at home, they wanted to promote their own national culture, their own nationalism. And that's how he, Julius Nyerere, and his supporters, followers, romanticized a local indigenous culture. It was not only him, it was only them. Again, they're fighting against the Western colonial experiences. They naturally, in a backlash manner, they naturally glorified and romanticized their own local culture, creating this mythology, romantic imagery of their pastoral view of African commune, where people lived in peace before this evil colonial people came and destroyed this peaceful world that had supposedly existed. Of course, we know that any place in the world. You know, it's 16 shades of gray, so there's peace, war, and everything. Okay, but that's not how these newly liberated elites thought about it. They naturally romanticized their pre-colonial experiences. Okay, playing down whatever warfare they had and romanticizing these communal patterns, and simultaneously ditching whatever Western experiences they had. I repeat, it was done in a backlash manner. Okay, but why Fabian ideas were picked up by Julius Nyerere? Because Fabians also criticized their own British experiences. Okay, they didn't like them. They criticized contemporary English society. So that is why it was another reason for Julius Nyerere and people like him to be interested in Fabian ideas, because Fabians themselves criticized their own contemporary society. Okay, so we should keep it in mind. So Julius Nyerere was in charge of a nation that received independence and wanted to build herself as a nation. On the other hand, he said, we're going to become a socialist nation. So this, again, I have to say it, Julius Nyerere and his supporters offered this a national socialist model for the local people to embrace. And Julius Nyerere was realizing that if you play hard this nationalist card, especially racial card, you would antagonize all other people. Yes, Tanzania was a country where we have the dominant black majority, but at the same time, there was a significant Hindu or Indian minority, okay? And the local black population, especially in the coastal cities, Indian coast, they had complaints against Indian merchants, okay? And in fact, many people who followed Julius Nyerere, they expected that all properties of local Indian merchants would be confiscated or given to local Africans, black Africans, or their properties would be nationalized by the state. And that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what happened, because the base of Julius Nyerere, they wanted to go after the Indians, local Indians. Okay, we got rid of the British colonial masters. Now we have to go against the local Indians. And in fact, Indians were declared the enemies of the people, and they were not citizens. The local authorities in Tanzania actually didn't want to recognize them as citizens, and many Indian merchants who lost their properties, they had to escape from Tanzania. It happened in the 1960s. But in all fairness, Julius Nyerere, he felt uncomfortable about this. On the one hand, look, he did right in 1949 when he just came, when he was, still in Britain. I quote him here, he wrote an essay called The Race Problem in Eastern Africa. He was thinking at that time how to get rid of the British colonial domination, and he wrote, I quote from his essay, "Africa is for the Africans, and the other races cannot be more than respected minorities. Should it become to be a better choice between being perpetually dominated by a white on an Indian minority and driving that minority out of East Africa, no thinking African would hesitate to make the latter choice," unquote. See, he did choose his tribe, his racial tribe. Okay, so we have to stress it. At the same time, when he came to power, when he saw how in 1960s his base was going after Indian minorities, he started to criticize him. He started to criticize them. he said, we cannot do it. Because if we go full ahead in this direction, he literally said this to his base. He found the guts to say this. He said, if we go full ahead in this direction, so what is the difference between us and Hitler in Europe? What is the difference between us and Hitler? He did say this. Okay. So he tried to put the brakes on this. But at the same time, we have to say, he had to go against the grain. Because much of his base expected from him that, in fact, much of his base interpreted the slogan of African socialism as in racial terms, okay, as the confiscational properties which did not belong to blacks. And Julius Nyerere saw that could be a problem. But he hardly could do anything, because if he would have embraced this criticism, if he would have gone after his base, he would have lost support. So he was trying to sit on two chairs. As a Catholic who was raised by missionaries, he, from a moral viewpoint, he felt very uncomfortable about this. In fact, he did find guts later to say that my party, TANU, Tanganyika African National Union, or Tanzanian African National Union, is the party that is open to all people. That's what he said. I'm not going to differentiate. So British, Indians, and of course indigenous Africans, which to some extent went against some activists of his party who didn't like it. Julius Nyerere was backed by the British Labour Party. Remember, in early 1950s, that was the party that was in power, trying to promote democratic socialism, and that's what Nyerere declared too. I'm going to build democratic socialism, but it would be an African socialism. Okay. He could not prevent his base from Africanizing governmental bureaucracy in Tanzania. Okay, so all bureaucracy, all state employees were totally African. Julius Nyerere, at the same time, did not allow open violence against Indians and other people. Okay, so we have to say it was something that he was able to police, so using his charisma, his popularity. Okay, so unfortunately, so many non-Africans did leave Tanzania when Tanzania was granted independence. But at the same time, there were no violent acts. There were calls for violent acts, but at the same time, there were hardly any riots, like attacks on Indian businesses. Julius Nyerere had a very, very high authority because he was a teacher, he spoke well. He became so-called Mwalima, teacher. So that wasn't like a charismatic title. So Tanzanian peasants, intellectuals worshipped him. So there was a small cult of personality. Okay, but at the same time, it was not like Stalin's cult of personality or Mao's cult of personality. Julius Nyerere tried to project this humble image of a humble guy who was close to the people. He tried to, when he appeared in public, he tried to merge with the people, okay, talking with them, smiling. Did not put himself high above the people. So that is why I'm using this expression, the benevolent dictator. Okay. He was a big idealist, not corrupt, we have to say, not corrupt. No. So many other dictators in Africa were very much corrupt. Like one of the most recent dictators, Robert Mugabe in Tanzania, who also had claimed socialism in 1970s, 1980s, that he are very much corrupt. But Nyerere, maybe his religious background, despite claiming socialism, Nyerere did remain a religious person, highly religious person, who believed this moral Christian ideal of being a good person. Okay. Still, the way for him to overcome poverty was socialism. That's what he claimed. Plus, again, don't forget, I keep repeating this, socialism in the 1960s was on the minds of people worldwide. It was the mainstream. Okay, it was the mainstream. Right now, for instance, you might be shocked when you read countries' history books about Africa or decolonization of Africa from 1945 to the present, and you will hardly see any mentioning of socialism. I was literally shocked when recently I went to San Francisco before this corona stuff and everything. November last year, I went to a conference in San Francisco, and I got in some big, huge bookstore. Forgot the name of the street. Downtown San Francisco. And I picked up a book called Africa and Decolonization, which was designed to be a textbook written by a highly popular professor whose books I used worldwide in history courses. In fact, I will give you his name. If you're interested, you can check if I'm right or not. His name is Jürgen Osterhammel. He wrote a textbook, world history textbook. He wrote a popular book on the history of colonialism, okay, and he also wrote a book on African decolonization. I don't remember exact title, but you can Google his name. Jürgen, start with J. Jürgen Osterhammel. And this guy, who is a professor of history, he wrote this book about decolonization of Africa from 1945 to the present without mentioning the word socialism. Although, if you backtrack, if you go to a contemporary historical setting, 1960s, 1970s, it was very much on the minds of the local elites. Okay, so it's an interesting example how people right now, for instance, it's on the left, and here Jürgen Osterhammel, he is a left-leaning scholar, socialist scholar. He doesn't want to damage this good image of socialism. So since in 1990s, almost all African elites, they rejected socialism, so they dumped it and they didn't even mention it. So, and he also did the same. He kind of dumped socialism in the memory hole and didn't mention it, Osterhammel. So it was a very shocking thing. So an example how a historian projects a contemporary notions, present day notions to history. Okay, so he reads history through the present day glasses. Anyway, socialism was very much on the minds of, as we keep stressing today, on the minds of the African elites, 1960s, and Julius Nyerere was one of them. Socialism was the way to make your country prosperous, independent. Okay. The blueprint of socialism, even though Julius Nyerere did not claim that he was following. See, that's another interesting thing. even though Julius Nyerere did not formally say, I'm going to follow Soviet or Chinese experience, at least at first. Then we will find out that he became interested in friendship with the Chinese. But at first, he didn't make these claims, 1961. He simply, what he did, he introduced the blueprint of socialism, generic socialism. What was generic socialism? Even though we had social democracy at that time, but what was the image of generic socialism at that time? Many people thought about one-party state, because the Soviets and then Chinese were the only example of living and breathing socialism at that time, okay? And these two countries, China and Soviet Union, they had a one-party state, right? So even those leaders who did not exactly link themselves to Chinese or Soviet experience, they also followed this blueprint. So Julius Nyerere was one of them. He declared one-party state. So my political party, TANU, this Tanzanian African National Union, would become the political party. So they took over power. But as I said, Nyerere said, we are not going to copy the West. And particularly, he said, we are not going to copy Marxian socialism. Why? Because Marxian socialism is not good. What is not good about Marxian socialism? I gave you to read this excerpt from his speech called African Socialism, the speech delivered by Julius Nyerere. Okay. In this speech and other works, he said that Marxian socialists, they pitch one class of people against another class of people. They pitch poor people against the rich people. They instigate hatred, class warfare. We don't need class warfare. Our African society traditionally was organic society. It was familyhood. We had lived like a family before these colonial powers came to dominate us. So we need to get back to this organic fellowship, okay, that had existed. And he, of course, it wasn't true, but that's what he said, and many agreed with him, romanticizing by traditional African peasant community. He said, we had lived by communes where everything belonged to everybody within community, okay? And he claimed that private ownership, it was a Western imposition, okay? And we do not need the proletariat, this industrial working class, because our indigenous peasants, peasant community, that's the cradle of socialism, okay? So this interesting folk socialism, so to speak, reminds us something, right? So again, he became one of these politicians who glorified, who was building his nation, tried to bring people together as a nation by using the slogans of romantic slogans of folk nationalism, local nationalism, arguing that we need to inject this nationalism with a large dose of socialism. Okay, so he played on the nationalist sentiments and on socialist sentiments. I repeat again this interesting blueprint of National Socialism. And he called this organic community he wanted to build Ujamaa. Ujamaa, it was Swahili. Remember I told you that local people in Tanzania, the most popular language, indigenous language, was Swahili. And Ujamaa in Swahili means a familyhood. So familyhood, this fellowship, supposedly indigenous fellowship where people help each other. And that's what's going to be our local socialism. Okay. See, I purposely found this meme, the cartoon, that to kind of explain to you what he meant, the ideal he was born in 1960s, what in his mind was to become Ujamaa. So we have to put an emphasis on his project. In the mind of Julius Nyerere, Ujamaa Socialism would be a bunch of local, big communal farms. Okay, so he imagined, Julius Nyerere, Tanzania as a fellowship of big agricultural collectives, okay, where local collectives would collectively own land. Even though, I repeat, land was declared the national property of the country, so it was the property of the state, but big agricultural collectives together in a cooperative manner would be working on this land. So basically, local agricultural collectives, they would hold this land. I wouldn't say own, they would hold these lands. Okay, imagine again a patchwork, a quilt, a patchwork of local self-governing agricultural communities. That was the ideal of Ujamaa Socialism in the mind of Julius Nyerere. So that is why I'm using this meme for you to help to understand what it means, Ujamaa Socialism. So it means cooperative economics, co-ops. He imagined Tanzania socialism as a bunch of agricultural co-ops, to make a long story short. And by the way, does it remind you something? I'm sure it does. Remember we talked about Yugoslavia. Remember Yugoslavia when Joseph Broz Tito had a clash with Joseph Stalin, and when Joseph Broz Tito had to come up with his own indigenous version of socialism to fight against Stalin's version of socialism. Remember what he came up with? With a similar idea. Similar idea. Local collectives that would collectively hold industrial sites and factories. And since Yugoslavia was not exactly an agricultural country, they did have farming there, but it was also a partially industrialized country. So Joseph Broz Tito talked about self-governing socialism, where local collectives would hold factories. They would elect their directors, managers, they would assign wages for themselves. And basically, Julius Nyerere was thinking along the same lines. No wonder, by the way, that as soon as he introduced his Ujamaa Socialism, Yugoslavia became very much interested in his experiment. And we have a bunch of advisors, consultants coming from Yugoslavia to Tanzania to help Julius Nyerere to set up these agricultural collectives. And by the way, we have advisors and consultants coming from Israel to help Julius Nyerere to set up agricultural collectives. Why? I have to jump ahead here, and you will see why. Next time, this Thursday, we're going to talk about Israeli socialism, so-called kibbutz, agricultural collectives, which were working along the same lines. So no wonder we have some consultants coming from Israel. So see the connection, this cooperative socialism. The idea was not to accept this Stalinist model of extreme centralization, but to build this commonwealth of semi-independent local agricultural collectives, which would exercise self-government. That was the idea of Julius Nyerere, which this idea received the help from Yugoslavian Israel. Okay, Julius Nyerere actually issued a call. Peasants, Tanzanian peasants, go ahead and create voluntarily these agricultural collectives. So his original idea of Julius Nyerere was to invite people to join these collectives voluntarily, and he expected that such a noble socialist idea grounded in indigenous culture would receive a wide response on the side of the people. That was the expectation, so please make a note of this. In fact, when Julius Nyerere declared his blueprint of this African democratic socialism based on this self-government of local agricultural collectives, oh, it was so appealing to social democrats in Western Europe. Not only Yugoslavia and Israel came to help him, but Western European social democrats come to help him. Okay, in fact, among social democrats there was what I call Tanzanophilia. Okay, so love for Tanzania. So the idea was that we have here in Africa a nice model which we can use against the Soviet Union. This Soviet Union, this brutal militant communist state that centralized everything. Everything is controlled by the state. But in Tanzania, we have like an alternative. Not only Yugoslavia, but Tanzania might become another alternative, maybe even better than Yugoslavia. So that is why they come and they bring money. They give a lot of money to Julius Nyerere. Sweden comes. In fact, Sweden becomes the biggest donor of Tanzania. I will tell you more. In the 1960s, Tanzania was the major recipient of Swedish international help. Okay. UK, remember, Labour Party was very powerful in UK. So UK comes to help Julius Nyerere. And finally, World Bank comes. World Bank, dominated by social democratic elites. In 1960s, there was a US guy, familiar name, Robert McNamara. Remember Robert McNamara? I think he was at some point a Secretary of Defense. Who had a soft spot for the left, strange as it may sound. Not the communist left, of course, but the social democratic left. So he actually promoted projects that were helpful to Tanzania, and he personally visited Tanzania, trying to bring the World Bank to this country. In fact, I will tell you again more. Tanzania became the largest recipient, and I included this in my slides, so please take a note of this. Tanzania becomes the largest recipient of foreign aid among other third world countries in 1960s. So much for self-reliance, because our original slogan was of Julius Nyerere to build a self-reliant Tanzanian state. Formal goals of African socialism were articulated by Julius Nyerere in 1967 in so-called Arusha Declaration. Okay, Arusha Declaration, where we see the new page in the history of African socialism. So before Arusha Declaration, we have this cooperative socialism when Julius Nyerere invited voluntarily Tanzanian peasants to join these agricultural communities. Okay, but since 1967, more and more we see what? his frustration about his own Tanzanian indigenous peasants, and also his frustration with the West. In fact, in many respects, he takes his frustrations on Britain and he wants to cut ties with Britain in order to amplify this local nationalism, because nationalism is the best way to unify people. So originally he didn't cut too many ties with Britain, but now he was cutting ties with Britain by saying that, oh, these colonial masters, we don't owe them anything, we have to cut ourselves. Okay. On the other hand, that's the most important thing. He sees that not many peasants want to join these agricultural collectives. His idea that was peasants would come and join socialist collectives, because at that time Tanzanian peasants, they lived on family farms. Some of them lived by extended families, some of them lived on family farms, some of these farms were separated from each other, so there was no this huge collective living together. Okay, no, and we have to emphasize this. But Julius Nyerere hoped that these peasants would come in big collectives. It didn't happen. So there were 5 to 6 pet projects, Ujamaa projects, and that was it. They occupied something like 5% of total economy, nothing. So peasants didn't want to be collectivized. That was the message. So we didn't want to voluntarily join your Ujamaa project. So he felt frustration. He felt frustrated, and he was taking this frustration on Britain, trying to amplify nationalism. And that's when we have this militant stage in, I wouldn't say totally militant, but radical, let's call it a radical stage in Ujamaa Socialism since the beginning of 1967. Okay, so he was upset about these communities. Communities didn't want to get united in large agricultural collectives. And he thinks that big government, Tanzanian government, should become more activist. And he said, our party should lead the people. See, at first he said, I don't have to do anything with a Soviet experience. And now he was leaning more and more to this Soviet type experience, okay? For the first time since 1967, Julius Nyerere declared 5-year plans. Again, it's from Stalin's playbook. It's a Stalin's playbook, 5-year plans. The state started to set up prices, honest prices, which of course started to gradually kill economy. When the government was setting up prices, what you have a black market. Okay, and then he replaced cooperative stores with governmental purchasing boards, which started to buy grain from these few Ujamaa collectives that had existed. He also created national militia. He also shut down the freedom of press. No more. Censorship increased in Tanzania. The goal was what? Was very clear. Julius Nyerere wanted to force peasants to join his Ujamaa Ujamaa project. So, since you did not join my project voluntarily, I'm going to force you. That was the message. I'm going to force you. At the same time, we have to stress there was no terror. Tanzania was not a totalitarian state. Okay, it was not like China or Russia. He didn't execute people. Let's make we have to emphasize this. But at the same time, people suffered. People were pushed. They were bullied. Houses of people who resisted a movement to the villages, big villages, were burned to the ground. So people were threatened. Troops were sent who simply loaded people and their stuff, loaded on trucks, and drove them away to be settled in government designated sites. So troops were used against people, police was used, but again, people were not put in concentration camps, people were not executed, people were simply bullied and forced to go to particular sites designated by the government as Ujamaa sites. Okay, the goal was to build up all over the country, to build up these big agricultural collectives along major roads. Why along the major roads? To deliver, to make sure that agricultural production would be delivered quickly. And of course, like it always happens, governmental bureaucrats frequently chose sites which were not fit for agriculture, which were not fit for cultivation. When you involve bureaucracy, peasants themselves knew on the ground where to live, what sites to choose for their residency. But that's not how governmental bureaucrats thought, okay? And that's what created this big tragedy. So we have to emphasize this. On the one hand, we have no terror, but on the other hand, there was a dictatorship that exercised its muscles to force people to move to these collectives. Since Julius Nyerere originally declared that he wasn't interested in the Soviet experience, he didn't mention China, so he started to go to China. He tried to reach out to the Chinese leadership, which, you know, the Chinese leadership themselves copied the Stalinist model. Okay, Mao Zedong, the chief of the Chinese communists, he was the one who cloned that Stalinist system, who indigenized the Stalinist system. And now Julius Nyerere comes to China and also tried to copy, because he lost his patience with his own peasants, so he became interested. So he tried to toy. I wouldn't say that he totally copied the Chinese model like China had copied the Soviet model before. No. So he simply picked up elements. He tried to toy with this Chinese Stalinist model. For example, he made friends with China. He said, oh, we are very much interested in Chinese experience. And he tried to create green guards. Remember, in 1960s, in China, they had so-called red guards that attacked communist bureaucrats. They shamed like principals at schools, humiliated them, college professors, were rioting on the streets, okay, beating people on the streets, you know, wrecking properties, basically intimidating people, trying to clear the way for Mao Zedong personal dictatorship, okay? And Julius Nyerere became interested in the Red Guards. He said, oh, these young people were so committed to Chinese socialism. They were very much obedient to the leader. And he liked this too. So he creates green guards in Tanzania who were personally loyal to him. And of course, he sends these green guards where? To create these agricultural collectives, Ujamaa. So to help soldiers and local bureaucrats to bully peasants, to force them to go to live in government designated sites. These collective farms, you know, basically what Julius Nyerere was doing, he was doing collectivization. Collectivization, what Stalin had done before. Of course, Stalin declared an open war on the peasants and he killed peasants. He sent those peasants who resisted collectivization to concentration camps. Again, Julius Nyerere didn't do it, I repeat, but he still used the troops and these green guards against peasants, forcing them to be collectivized. At this point, 1973, by the way, it happened. He nationalized all properties that still remained in the hands of whites and Asian merchants, Indians primarily, like to try to throw this bone to his base. which didn't like this non-Africans owned properties. Okay, so real estate, businesses, restaurants, real estates, houses that belonged to Indians and whites were confiscated. Okay, and became state property. And of course, it was very much popular among native Africans, because that's when you toy with nationalism, with some racial elements, of course, you placate to some of your base. Okay, that's what unfortunately happens. He also was purging public schools from Western capitalist ideas, trying to preach this indigenous African socialism. That was his goal. Okay, simultaneously forcing peasants to go to live in governmental designated sites. So life became miserable. The entire economic life was disrupted in the country. Of course, it did not visible at first, but a few years later, it did become visible. Look what he said, 1976, right when this campaign of village socialism. Okay, in fact, from 1973 to 1979, Julius Nyerere declared a governmental operation to force peasants to go to live in these agricultural collectives. It became known officially, this Green Guards, soldiers, police trying to force peasants to go and to live in these sites chosen by the government, Ujamaa sites. This project received the name, it was called Operation Planned Villages. See? Operation Planned Villages. So right in the middle of this Operation Planned Villages, so the villages were planned from up above by the government. So Julius Nyerere totally departed from his original idea to give self-government to these collectives on the ground. Now it was the government that called the shots. Look what he said, I quote, "I could not turn people into socialists by force, but my government would ensure that everybody live in a village," unquote. Interesting, eh? Interesting quotation. And of course, a few years later, we see this debacle of Ujamaa Socialism. In 1979, decline of agricultural production. Tanzania, that was an exporter of grain, exporter of corn, now begins to import food. In fact, we don't have exact numbers, but according to estimates of some economists, up to 70% of all peanut crops, corn crops were gone. So the yield peasants collected was down by 70% by the end of 1970s. It was total debacle. So agricultural production was in shambles. Soon we have food and consumer good shortages. Again, I want to emphasize it here. You can see it on my slide. From a country exporting corn, Tanzania turned to a country importing corn. It all because of peasants who were dislodged from traditional villages and forced to live in governmental villages. Essentially, we deal with peasant families who were rounded up by governmental bureaucrats, helped by police and green guards, who forced people into poorly chosen sites. Of course, peasants resisted to this forced settlement. They tried to escape from these villages, ignoring governmental decrees, ignoring governmental quotas. See, government tried to issue quotas, deliver a certain amount of grain, but fortunately for Tanzania, local police didn't have enough guts to promote these decisions. So I guess Tanzania was, quote unquote, infected enough with the British ideas of constitutionalism. Okay, plus Tanzania was not a closed country. Okay, you could still go in and out of Tanzania. Okay, it was not a totally closed society. The police didn't have enough teeth there to force people to completely kind of follow the quotes, and many peasants simply ignored governmental decrees. They either escaped from these collectives or they chose to work on their individual plots, neglecting governmental plots. So each Ujamaa collective, by the way, had the two-field system. There was a big field, collective field, where all peasants were obligated to work. And in addition, each family, like in Stalin's Russia, by the way, they had small individual plots to work on. Okay, so that's where peasants mostly spent their time, working on their individual plots, and nobody wanted to work on collective plots. Okay. Debacle. On top of this debacle, there was a war in 1979 with Uganda. That's a neighboring state. Okay. There was a dictator in Uganda, a brutal dictator compared to Julius Nyerere, who was brutal enough too, but didn't practice at least open genocide against his people. Okay, Tanzania, Uganda had border clashes over territory, so Tanzania became involved right in the middle of this Operation Planned Villages. Tanzania became involved into this war with Uganda, which contributed to even more economic decline. So the government now introduced ration. So food was rationed. A free trade of food was forbidden. So government started issue rations in Tanzania. Fortunately, by the end of 1980s, it was clear that Operation Planned Villages didn't work. Ujamaa Socialism was a disaster. And we have to give credit to Julius Nyerere. Again, a very rare specimen among the dictators. Somewhere in 1989, Julius Nyerere said, I quote, "I'm a very poor prophet. My experiment didn't work, you know." Think about this. Who else among dictators said this? I don't know. Except one, I have to tell you, Augusto Pinochet in Chile, who was responsible for some crimes. But the guy found the guts eventually to step down. Okay, but it's a right-wing dictator, Pinochet, who declared a nationwide referendum, who at some point stepped down and allowed people to rule themselves. I don't know any other dictators. And see, here we have another example. It's Julius Nyerere, a left-wing dictator, benevolent dictator, who in the same way admitted that I'm a very poor prophet. And in fact, he stepped down, not right away, but gradually stepped down. He allowed multi-party system to exist, which eventually was introduced, and did not resist. He even didn't seek re-election. Before he was each time re-elected, it was like he was re-elected each year, you know, like a national leader. Everybody voted for him. But for the first time, he was not re-elected because he disagreed himself. He said, "I'm not going to run for president." He stepped down. He even questioned one-party system. It's an interesting thing. I guess some of his British experiences kicked in. Plus, don't forget, I'm jumping ahead, unfortunately, here. See, we didn't talk yet. About the debacle of the Soviet Union. We didn't talk yet about partial debacle of socialism in China. So Julius Nyerere did not live in a vacuum. So in 1989, 1990, we see the grand debacle of socialism worldwide in Soviet Union, in China, in India. And of course, Julius Nyerere was observing these. So which prompted him eventually to say that, oh, one-party system didn't work. And the last Ujamaa village was disbanded in the middle of 1990s. Okay, they don't exist anymore. So nationalized enterprises were sold back to private owners, and we can talk about the revival, partial revival of the market, free market system. And as your a major book which I give you to read for this course, written by Muravchik, Heaven on Earth, he says in one of his documentaries based on this book, Muravchik, I think he issued a very apt observation about what Julius Nyerere accomplished in Tanzania. So he said that Julius Nyerere succeeded in building the Tanzanian nation, but he failed to bring to life his socialist utopia. Okay, so he did build Tanzanian nationalism, he built this nation, but he failed to bring socialism to Tanzania. Okay, on this note, let me finish my story, and I will see you next time. Thank you for your attention.